In our second tutorial on the Home Cost Allocation tool, we will address the issue of comparability between the units in a development. The determination of whether units are comparable or not comparable influences two key decisions. First, in terms of the cost allocation process, the comparability determination helps drive which method of cost allocation we can use. And on a separate but somewhat related point, comparability will also drive the choice of whether a PJ designates fixed or floating home units in a rental project. If we determine that a project's units are not comparable, then we must use the standard method of cost allocation, and the PJ must designate fixed home units. That is, by designating specific units, let's say Unit 301, 402, and 507, which will always be the project's home units throughout the period of affordability. On the other hand, if a project's units are comparable, then the PJ can choose to use either the proration or potentially the hybrid method of cost allocation. Those methods, along with the standard method, will be addressed in greater detail in future tutorial segments. Additionally, when the units are comparable, a PJ can choose to designate floating home units. Floating home units, as the name implies, move around or float within the development during the period of affordability. This year, Unit 301 might be the home unit, but next year it's possible the home designation has floated to Unit 401 as tenants turn over and the incomes of those who are in place change. What do we mean when we talk about units being comparable? We don't mean that units have to be identical to one another, but the idea is that comparable units are sufficiently similar as to be considered interchangeable. CPD Notice 16-15 identifies 4 issues that PJ should consider when evaluating comparability. First is the general configuration of the units. Here we're talking about the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and total rooms. We're looking to see if units have the same basic configuration, even if there are minor variations in the specific layout. Next, we go beyond the configuration to look at the size of the units in terms of their square footage. Again, not every unit has to be identical in square footage to be comparable. Minor variations due to how units get laid out in the overall building are common. For example, a unit next to the stairs may lose a little space as a result of the staircase, while an end unit might gain a few feet here and there. But if a group of units is going to be comparable in terms of size, then each unit should be within a small variance of the average for all such units. HUD has not defined a specific metric, so PJs need to define this for themselves. But a starting rule of thumb might be that no individual unit should vary from the average by more than 5%, with perhaps a small additional variation allowed for physically accessible units, since they sometimes require more space to provide wider hallways, clear spaces, and other accessibility features. The third issue to consider is the amenities, fixtures, and finishes. If some units are being provided with higher quality fixtures, finishes, or appliances than others, the units are not comparable. For example, if some units have stainless steel appliances, granite countertops, and hardwood flooring, while others have basic appliances, Formica counters, and contractor-grade flooring, the units can't be considered comparable. Finally, particularly in projects that have so-called market rate units, PJ should review the proposed rent schedule to ensure that the units with the same configuration, size, and amenities have roughly the same market value. Absent the home restrictions, if a developer suggests that certain units are being priced higher than others, it's a pretty good indication that something about those units is not comparable. We should also note that while in some projects all of the units may be of the same basic type, for example, the entire project is made up of 2-bedroom, 1-bath units of roughly the same square footage, it's probably more common that a development will have different groups or tranches of units. Clearly, a 1-bedroom unit won't be comparable to a 3-bedroom unit, but it is possible we will determine that all of the project's 1-bedroom units are comparable to each other, and all of its 3-bedroom units are comparable to one another. So in general, we're looking at configuration, square footage, finishes and amenities, and the market rents. But how do PJs operationalize these reviews? PJs should review a project's plans and specifications. In fact, Section 92-251 of the Home Final Rule already requires a PJ to review the construction documents for new construction and rehab projects anyway, so you're really just looking at the same information for more than one purpose. In reviewing the plans and drawings, a PJ needs to review unit layouts and square footages. In most cases, especially for new construction, the architect will include a summary table identifying the number and location of different unit types, and even subtypes, as we'll see in the upcoming case studies. But if those summaries are not included, a more detailed review of the floor plans may be required. The drawings will get at the issues of configuration and square footage, but for finishes and amenities, we need to look at the specifications. Here we're looking for differences in things like plumbing fixtures, countertops, cabinets, appliance packages, and the like. Some PJs, to help speed their review and make expectations clear, ask questions or require specific disclosures from the applicant or architect in the PJ's application package to identify whether there are material differences in the finishes, fixtures, or amenities. One other thing to note here. Remember, what the PJ needs to determine is that the units are sufficiently similar, not identical. In particular, there may be some differences between the finishes in physically accessible units. For example, using solid surface flooring instead of carpet, or slightly different kitchen packages that are driven by the accessibility standards for such units, but that are not really significant in terms of whether the units are interchangeable. Similarly, in some acquisition rehab projects of existing rental properties, not every unit might be getting the same level of rehab today. For example, Unit 101 got new appliances 2 years ago along with new carpet in the normal course of replacement, and Unit 201 is being rehabbed as part of the project today and will get different but basically similar appliances, and is also getting new flooring. But the owner is putting in solid surface flooring that will be more durable over time. When Unit 101 comes up again for flooring in a few years, it will get the same basic treatment. In this case, even though there are some differences between the units, it's probably reasonable for the PJ to conclude that the amenities are substantially similar enough to be comparable. So let's look at an example, which we've labeled Case A. As we noted, it's common for the architect to include a summary table of the architectural unit types, and this is one pulled from an actual home project. You can see the project has 70 total units, 10 of which are one-bedroom units, along with 60 two-bedroom units. The one-bedroom units have been labeled by the architect as A, B, and C units. We see that the B unit, which is physically accessible, has 847 square feet, while the others all have 846 square feet. We don't need to do a lot of math to determine that the variation in size is insignificant. But let's take a closer look at the two-bedroom units, which have been labeled as the D, DD, E, and F units. Here we see that the D units are 1,143 square feet, while the rest of the two-bedroom units are 1,124 square feet. When we go to fill out the cost allocation tool, we will need the average square footage of each group or tranche of units. So let's do the math. Again, we see that the one-bedroom units are very close. The overall average is 846.2, which we've determined by adding together the square footage of each of the architectural unit types and dividing by the 10 one-bedroom units. In the case of the two-bedroom units, we do the same thing. 67,896 total square feet of two-bedroom units divided by the 60 units gives us an average of 1,131.6. So even though we see that the D-type units are a little bigger than the average at 1,143, they only have about 11 or 12 more square feet, while the others are all at about 6 square feet smaller than the average. That's really close, with the largest and smallest units each only varying from the average by about 1%. While it's not on the screen here, we're able to determine from the project specifications that the finishes and fixtures of all the units are the same. So we conclude that the units in this project are comparable in two tranches. We have 10 one-bedroom units that are comparable and 60 comparable two-bedroom units. So let's look at another case study, labeled Case B. Here again we have a mix of one and two-bedroom units, but the architect has broken them out into more subtypes. Before going any further, I want to point out one quick thing. In this summary table, the architect has identified the gross square footage, which we've grayed out, and the net square footage, which they labeled the HUD net rentable square footage, which is based on the methodology for FHA multifamily programs. In general, the net square footage is measured from the inside of the interior walls of the unit, while the gross square footage includes the thickness of exterior walls and usually half the wall space between units. For cost allocation purposes, we want to work from the interior square footage of the unit, which is the space the tenant actually sees and can access. That's usually labeled as the net square footage. So, let's look at the one-bedroom units, which includes architectural types A1 through A6, as well as the B and C type units, which are physically and sensory impaired units as required by Section 504. In this example, we see a good bit more variation in the size of the units. The smallest one-bedroom units have 631 square feet, while the largest are at 724. Before we even do the math, I have a sense that's going to be a significant difference. The two-bedroom units are labeled by the architect as D1 through D3, as well as the E and F type units. Again, there's more variation than in our first case study example, with most units at 893 or 895 square feet, but a few units are a good bit bigger at 1,011. So let's take a closer look at the floor plans. We can see the differences when we compare the A2 unit type, which is the smallest one bedroom at 631 square feet, with the A5 unit type, which is the largest at 724. At the top of the drawing, the basic width of the units is pretty close. Given the size of text on your screen, you'll have to trust me, but the overall width of the A2 unit is 25 feet 7 inches, while the A5 unit is only 10 inches wider. The bathroom, entry hall, and kitchen are all basically the same, as are the closets, and the bedrooms are nearly identical, with only a 2-inch difference in the width. But the real difference between these units is in the living room. The A5 type unit, again take my word for it as the dimensions may not show up well on your screen, is around 6 feet longer, translating to a living room that is around 80 square feet larger. Even before we do the math, intuitively, that's a significant difference in what the tenant of an A2 type unit is getting versus the tenant of an A5 type unit. Clearly, the A5 unit is going to be more desirable to most tenants and not seen to objective observers as interchangeable with an A2 unit. So let's take another look. We've concluded there is meaningful variation within the one-bedroom and two-bedroom groupings. We have two options. First, we can treat the units as non-comparable, which will require us to use the standard method of cost allocation and designate fixed home units. Or we can take a closer look and see if a more subtle definition of unit types is appropriate. In this example, we could reasonably treat the one-bedroom units not as a single group, but as two different unit types. We have 5 large one-bedroom units, which are all at 724 square feet, and we have another 31 small one-bedroom units, which average 648 square feet. Looking back at the architect's unit breakdown, the smallest of those is 631 square feet, and the biggest is 659, so the variation is within about plus or minus 3% of the average. Similarly, the two-bedroom units can also be broken into two groups: large units at 1,011 square feet, and small units at an average of 895. With no unit varying from that average by more than 2 square feet. That's a difference no one's going to notice. So let's look at one last example. Here's the layout of the first floor of an adaptive reuse project that converted an old orphanage into housing. We see immediately that every unit is different, and those differences are significant. Among the one-bedroom units, the largest unit is more than twice the size of the smallest, and it has an extra half bathroom compared to the others. The two-bedroom units are quite different as well, both in terms of square footage and the number of bathrooms. And although the three-bedroom units on this floor are similar, when you look at the project as a whole, there's no practical way to split the units into a series of comparable groupings. The variations are just too significant. So here we conclude that the units are not comparable, and we'll have to use the standard method and designate fixed units. In our next segment, we'll discuss eligible and ineligible home costs and how to distinguish between the two for cost allocation purposes.